majority will pass legislation.
I will fight like hell for you every single day, like I've always done and always will.
Passing these bills on the floor, making yet another stand.
Welcome to New York Now. I'm David Lombardo, host of WCNY's The Capitol Press Room, a daily public radio show covering state government and politics. This was the penultimate week of the legislative session at the Capitol, with lawmakers scheduled to depart Albany for the remainder of the year in just a couple of days. It's unclear what big-ticket items may get done between now and the end of the legislative session, but we'll have a full legislative roundup in a later show. But for this week, we're going to turn our attention to court rulings that could have a major impact on laws adopted under Governor Kathy Hochul. This includes an effort to get a ballot referendum before voters in November, which would add a so-called equal rights amendment to New York's Constitution, as well as a legal threat to the legitimacy of the state's ethics watchdog, which is being challenged by former Governor Andrew Cuomo. We broke down these rulings and more with Politico New York Capitol reporter Bill Mahoney. Here's that discussion. Well, welcome to the show, Bill. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So this fall, Democratic state lawmakers and Governor Kathy Hochul were hoping that there would be a ballot referendum before voters that would let them choose to add a so-called equal rights amendment to the state constitution. Republicans in New York, for their part, have said, whoa, not so fast, and have raised some legal objections. Can you explain what they've brought in court?
So when a constitutional amendment needs to pass two separately elected legislatures, so basically once and then once again a couple years later, and then brought to the voters as a referendum. The first time they did this was shortly after the Supreme Court weighed in on striking down the Roe v. Wade precedent, and they rushed to get something through the door. They had this equal rights amendment that had been kicking around in various forms for a few years at that point, and decided to use that as a response to basically enshrine the state's protections to abortion in the Constitution. Right. So they had a template and they didn't need to do too much, and they rushed it through the legislature. They came back, and I think it was introduced a couple hours before they voted on it. They got a message of necessity from Governor Kathy Hochul that let them waive the usual 3-day waiting period and carried on with their plans, all seemingly full steam ahead. But there was a lawsuit brought in Livingston County last fall by Assemblymember Marjorie Burns, an outgoing Republican, that basically alleged they skipped a step in this whole process. There is language in the state constitution that says the Attorney General shall have time to review an amendment to basically make sure there's no technical problems, like you don't accidentally ban voting or something by passing some amendment on equal rights, like just making sure there's no weird wording things that happen that affect other parts of the Constitution. They didn't wait for that to happen this time and just voted on it without it happening. Now, the Attorney General came out a week later and said, yeah, this is fine, there's no issues. And then they voted on it again 2 years later, and it seemed all cut and dry. But they argued that by skipping this step, that means that they couldn't actually pass it that first time, and it needs to go back to the drawing board and start from square one, or maybe square two. Maybe the second time they pass it can count as the first time, and they could do it again next year and then send it to the voters in 2025 or something. But as of now, that's a judge has sided with them and said, yeah, you skipped this step, so that doesn't count. And I'm sorry, it can't be on the ballot this year.
Well, what comes next then in this process? I have to imagine the state feels like this was a minor technicality and that it should be on the ballot. So is this something that's going to make its way through the appeals process, potentially ending up at the state's top court prior to Election Day?
Yeah, it should make it through the appeals process pretty quickly. It's not technically an election-related case. It's more of like a legislature voting on constitutional grounds case, but it affects this year's elections. It has to do with something that's on the ballot in November. And usually those cases are expedited. So sometimes you might be talking about like a year for it to work its way through the appellate process at least. And something like this, I would be surprised if we're waiting much past August at the latest.
The legislature passed this bill at the Capitol based here in Albany. This case, though, was brought out in Livingston County. For viewers who aren't familiar, this is out in western New York. Is this another example of so-called judge shopping like we saw with the challenges Republicans brought to redistricting, or should we view this as a good faith effort brought by a Republican lawmaker in their home county?
That's what Democrats allege. If you were to pick a court somewhere in the state that would be friendly to Republicans, it's tougher to find somewhere more Republican friendly than Livingston County. Republicans have noted that there was a judge from Monroe County, from a more Democratic-friendly Rochester area, brought in to actually hear the case. So that they say that undermines any allegations of forum shopping. And also Marjorie Burns, who brought the suit, lives in Livingston County, and so they would argue that she shouldn't have to drive to Manhattan or something to file this case.
So aside from the policy difference that Democrats and Republicans might have over an equal rights amendment, which, as you mentioned, would codify and protect abortion rights as well as rights of gender and other sort of immutable rights that are not currently part of the state constitution, is there a political game at play here? Is there something that Democrats and Republicans see as impacting the November elections by having this on the ballot?
Well, Democrats certainly have been hoping to use this to help energize their voters this fall. New Yorkers are solidly behind abortion rights by any poll that's ever been conducted. We also know that the New York Democrats and Democrats in general aren't too energized behind Joe Biden and other candidates who are on the ballot this year. So there is a risk that some New York Democrats might stay home, which, a pretty long shot that would threaten Joe Biden's chances to win the state, but down ballot,
right.
There might be fewer solid Democrats showing up to vote in congressional races if they're just not feeling too energized. And the thought for Democrats has been, hey, put abortion on the ballot. This will get voters ginned up, and they'll be out there. They'll be more willing to show up because this is something they care about.
Well, turning to another legal issue, former Governor Andrew Cuomo has been waging a campaign against the state's nascent ethics watchdog. Can you explain his beef with the State Commission on Ethics and Lobbying in Government?
Well, they want to take away $5 million from him. It boils down to that.
Yeah.
He had his pandemic memoir, which he wrote when he was, during the slow months of summer when he was not dealing with the pandemic, despite the fact that much of the state was closed down. Mm-hmm. There have been various allegations since then that he has used state resources to help write this book. There have been several ethics investigations into this, some of which have kind of faltered for technical problems. And when this new commission was created, one of the first things it did apparently was indicate to Cuomo that they were going to be investigating this book deal again and possibly seeking him to forfeit the $5 million he was paid to write the book because he used state resources. So he quickly sued, trying to block the entire commission from existing, basically. And we've now had two courts that have sided with him.
Yeah, and his argument is essentially that the construction of the ethics body is what's at fault here, that the executive body hasn't had enough influence over the makeup of the commission?
Yeah, most of the commissioners come from the legislature, and even those who come from the governor are not directly appointed by the governor. There's this whole weird intermediary step of law school deans signing off on them beforehand, which pretty unique in state law. That does, to some degree, fulfill what people like Cuomo have promised for decades, some degree of independent ethics. The big complaint over ethics enforcement during the Cuomo years was that the governor controlled everything and they couldn't investigate Cuomo's allies for anything because he pulled all the strings. Now, this removes some of those close connections, but he argues that by doing so, it runs afoul of separations of powers doctrines, where the executive needs to control the executive branch, and saying that this entity that mostly comes from the legislative branch, can't have complete control over investigating the executive branch.
So we had a unanimous ruling from a mid-level appeals court in favor of the argument that Cuomo made. What does that mean in the short term and I guess maybe long term for the work of this ethics body? Is it able to function right now, or if I'm a lawmaker, is now the right time to take a bribe?
Most people believe that there's going to be some sort of a stay from the Court of Appeals, the top court, that will let them continue their work as this continues to work its way through the court. But it does certainly create some problems for serious investigations going forward. If you are a legislator who would be subject to a commission or an investigation from the commission, you could just say, I'm going to file the same suit and block you from investigating me because, Andrew Cuomo won, so sorry, but you can't do anything right now. And even if they did bring the hammer down on somebody, that person would be able to defend themselves saying, this commission, 6 judges now have all decided that it's illegally constructed. And so what they're saying, can you really trust what they're saying about what I did? It does raise some questions of legitimacy, at least in the short term, for their ability to conduct investigations.
And theoretically, the legislature and Governor Kathy Hochul at any point could have come back and adopted some sort of changes to the commission's body, because we've seen the problem here. The writing's been on the wall for months and months and months that there might be heading this way in a legal ruling. But finally, with the minute or so we have left, we've gotten some pretty definitive rulings on a change to early voting that Democratic state lawmakers advanced, essentially allowing for what we might call no excuse mail voting as part of early voting. It looks like this is going to be upheld by the courts. How big of a deal is that to the actual process of voting? Do you think that is dramatically going to reshape the electorate in New York, starting with the primaries in June?
Well, I do think that a lot of people still aren't fully aware of it. We saw a lot of people voting by mail in 2020, the first time this was widely available. I don't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head, but it was just a surge. Nobody wanted to show up to their polling place, and probably in some races close to half, if not more, of the ballots were submitted by mail. I don't know if it's fully processed yet that this is an option for people, and most people who vote will continue to show up to the polls, but it certainly does give an option for forward-thinking campaigns to explore a new way of reaching out to people. They might look and see, hey, this person has only voted twice in the past 10 years. Maybe we can encourage them to send in a ballot by mail, and that'll get them to actually show up remotely to the polls at least. So it should change things certainly going forward, but at least in the short term, I don't know if we can see dramatic surges in the number of mail-in votes, but we'll find out soon.
And we'll have that story and much more in the future, hopefully. Well, we've been speaking with Politico New York Capitol reporter Bill Mahoney. Bill, thank you so much for making the time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And as we mentioned in the discussion, all of those cases could end up before the state's top court. So we'll be following these challenges closely, and we'll bring you any new developments as they occur. But now we're going to pivot to New York's green energy transition, which was kicked into high gear with the adoption of the 2019 Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, requiring the state to dramatically shrink its carbon footprint and embrace renewable energy. We recently got an update on this effort from New York State Energy Research and Development Authority President and CEO Doreen Harris, who joined us in the studio. Well, thanks so much for making the time, President Harris. I really appreciate it.
Great to be here.
So there has been a lot of tumult in the state's effort recently to realize some of its green energy goals. There have been a lot of good news over the last years, but there's been some setbacks over the last 6 to 12 months as well. When you think about the landscape right now as it pertains to realizing the statutorily mandated 70% renewable electricity by 2030 benchmark, where do you think we are?
Well, it has been a challenging year, but it's been a year in which, first of all, the governor's been crystal clear and in fact, issuing a 10-point action plan last fall that we've really been executing against, that not only does our commitment remain firm with respect to the achievement of our goals, but also we've been acting very swiftly to respond to very real industry challenges. The renewable industry was impacted by what I would say are global trends, challenges with inflation, supply chain constraints, and interest rates. It's really affecting our entire economy. And we really needed to make quick work to reset our portfolio and to continue our progress toward our renewable goals, but also our broader climate goals at the same time.
Well, when you think about the renewable goals specifically, how, if at all, does the strategy look a lot different now than maybe your approach a couple of years ago, maybe in the immediate aftermath of the adoption of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act in 2019? Does anything stand out to you that's particularly different?
Well, the climate law by itself, it's an ambitious law. Full stop. It's requiring, I'd say, an order of magnitude difference with respect to the deployment of renewables, as was the case even 5-6 years ago. So certainly it accelerated our progress, and we needed to move more quickly to get projects both in our pipeline, but also constructed and operating. The climate law goals 2030 is not far away, and so we've had to make quick work of not only increasing the scale, but all of the corollary systems necessary to move these projects forward.
But given, say, the challenges that we've experienced over the last year with some contracts pulling the plug, some rebids going out, how do you think about this project? And is there anything that you've learned that you're implementing now that maybe wasn't part of the strategy a couple years ago?
Sure. I mean, certainly we do have to move quickly, but we also have to think about the ways in which we can really accelerate all aspects of project development. These projects take many, many years to move from concept to operation. In the case of an offshore wind project, as an example, it might be 10 years.
Right.
And so a lot happens in 10 years. And so I'd say one thing that we've learned is how to help these projects bridge that gap more effectively. Our contracts include provisions, for example, that reflect perhaps changing inflation along that time frame to help buttress, I'd say, the projects moving forward, de-risk them, if you will. But also, when you think about siting projects, we need to make that process much more swift as well. So one example would be I'd say the establishment of the Office of Renewable Energy Siting, which has accelerated the permitting and siting of the generation projects. Now, through this year's budget, we had the RAPID Act, which expands the authority of that office for transmission siting as well. So those are examples of the ways in which we've learned and accelerated along the way.
Part of that move you just talked about also brings the Office of Renewable Energy Siting under the oversight of the Public Service Commission, and I'm curious what you see as the ramifications, if any, of that administrative change.
I think one aspect of this that will be extraordinarily important is the acceleration of transmission projects. This is another lesson learned. We knew the grid was going to expand greatly throughout the coming number of decades. But when you look at the amount of transmission build out across our state, we have 62 projects moving forward upstate. We have 4 major bulk transmission projects advancing across the city and through upstate. It has to happen faster and in a manner that is standardized. So I'd say one major benefit of this will really have the benefit of that acceleration as well.
So a lot of this transmission is focused on getting renewable power to where it is needed most. And in New York, that is the huge population mecca that is New York City. And that means sending transmission lines across some areas that aren't necessarily going to benefit from that power that's moving across their area, yet they're still going to be shouldering some of the costs. Does that make sense to you?
So transmission siting is certainly an area that is expanding across the state. A great example is the Champlain-Hudson Power Express project, which is under construction as we speak. It's 339 miles of transmission lines that will need to be constructed over the coming couple of years.
And that's an international project.
It is. It's bringing renewable electricity from Canada all the way into New York City. Commercial operation date in 2026. It's a real game changer, not only from the perspective of getting at that need in New York City, but also, I'd say, bringing a scale forward that is quite significant in and of itself. What I would say about transmission is actually, I'd zoom out a little bit and say our entire state is going to need investments in transmission. We have certainly needs to serve our load in New York City at scale, but as we look into the future, we have a lot of load growth we expect upstate as well. So what that means is the entire state is going to have benefits coming from these investments, as well as generation projects moving forward at the same time.
So in terms of building out the state's renewable energy capacity, it seems like the focus is primarily on developing new solar and offshore wind projects. But Politico New York reported recently that the governor, in a private meeting with some environmental and energy stakeholders, made some inquiries into the potential for new nuclear development. And I'm curious what you see as the options for nuclear power moving forward, and is that something you're exploring in any meaningful way?
Sure, yeah. So we are full steam ahead on renewable resources as described. I'm really excited. In fact, last week, the Public Service Commission just approved the construction start for the Empire Wind 1 project, a big offshore wind project. The 2 projects that were just approved and awarded by NYSERDA are going to serve about 10% of New York City's electricity needs. So I want to make clear that renewables remain a central focus of our state, and particularly toward our 2030 goals. But we've begun looking at what post-2030 needs will be of our state. The Public Service Commission opened a proceeding on our 2040 goals as a state, which are a zero-emission grid by 2040. And one of the resources that is under exploration as part of that proceeding is nuclear. In fact, we at NYSERDA are conducting techno-economic studies that will inform that proceeding, looking at nuclear in all ways, not just the conventional generation that we have for our upstate fleet, but advanced reactors, small modular reactors, and other what they call next-gen technologies that have emerged. So I would say as a general matter, we have said that we are going to explore many resources and a diversity of resources to reach our goals. Nuclear is certainly on the table from this evaluation perspective as we speak.
And in terms of the opportunities with nuclear moving forward, are they solely rooted in taking advantage of maybe existing power locations that maybe have infrastructure in place like transmission lines, or is there an opportunity to build projects from scratch moving forward? I mean, because you talk about these timelines moving forward, and I have to imagine being able to take advantage of existing transmission lines or whatever infrastructure is out there would be opportunistic for some people.
So this is why when you think about any resource, offshore wind, we had a massive master plan that was undertaken over multiple years. I really think the same way about the possibility of a nuclear generation asset, because it is the case that when one looks at how that technology has evolved, yes, there are opportunities that could be applicable at existing power generation stations. But frankly, there's a lot of other areas in which some of these reactors can be sited. I'll call them micro-sited, used for perhaps new economic development loads that may be more distributed across the state. It's really an area that we need to look at very deliberately, and I don't have a preconceived notion about what form it might take.
Well, sticking with the great reporting from Politico New York, at that same stakeholders meeting, Marie French reported that there was some conversation about the need to appoint a climate czar to oversee the broad-reaching ramifications of the 2019 Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. I have designated you the state's energy czar, but so as the energy czar, what do you see as the pros and cons of a climate czar?
Well, I would say as a general matter, the Climate Action Council literally was formed, resulting from the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, to bring together many agencies around the topic of how to achieve that outcome. So I suppose if one wanted to say there was a climate czar, it would be the co-chairs of that council, I being one of them. So if I occupy the seat of energy czar, I would agree generally that that council was extraordinarily valuable because of the ways in which this climate law needs to be implemented. It is the case that everyone should be thinking about the law as they make decisions, whether it be Empire State Development, Homes and Community Renewal, all of the agencies, the ecosystem of the state writ large needs to come together. And in doing so, whether there's a climate czar or not, what I want to make clear is this is something that the entire government has as a central focus, because that's what the law requires.
Well, moving forward, though, because the Climate Action Council is kind of in our rearview mirror at this point, what do you see as the benefits of a centralized decision maker or administrator, or do you feel like it could actually backfire in some meaningful way?
I don't have a particular opinion on a central administrator, but from the perspective of the law itself and its implementation, this is very much where we are. An example is the State Energy Plan. That is a statutory requirement that I actually chair the state's Energy Planning Board. Like, we are going to be kicking off that process this year because it is very necessary for us to be looking at the question of how. How does one achieve these goals? And I think we have a very strong infrastructure in place to do just that.
Well, given how many different state agencies and state entities are involved with this climate transition, New York Power Authority comes to mind, the Public Service Commission, the DEC, as well as NYSERDA, What sort of relationship or communication do all of you heads engage with? Is there a text thread? Do you guys have a secret coded language at this point? What's the back and forth like?
So it is the case that, first of all, organizationally, the energy and environment portfolio is integrated from the perspective of the governor's office and her cabinet. We engage regularly on many, many decisions because of the interrelated nature of those decisions. I don't know if there's a secret text thread, but full stop, we need to coordinate, and that's just what we do.
Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave things there. I want to thank Doreen Harris, President and CEO of the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, for making the time. Thank you so much, Doreen.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll continue to follow New York's green energy transition, including controversial legislation curtailing the use of natural gas. But that's going to be it for this week's show. For additional New York Now content, as well as past episodes, make sure you visit nynow.org, and be sure to tune in next week when Chantel Destra will be back to round up the legislative session at the Capitol. For everyone at WMHT, I'm David Lombardo, and thanks for watching this edition of New York Now.
Funding for New York Now is provided by WNET,